Behind the Attic Wall by Sylvia Cassedy, Chapter 2. The first thing Maggie's eye rested on as she stared out the car window was the brass plaque next to the huge double doors. Adelphi Hills Academy, it said, and she knew that once again she had been tricked. There were no great aunts, and there was no house. She was being delivered to another boarding school. Of all the school buildings she had ever seen, though, this was by far the most menacing. Nothing stirred anywhere, no curtain, no leaf, no spiral of smoke, and no color broke the smoothness of its walls. It was like a photograph in black and white, fallen from the pages of some forgotten album. Uncle Morris unfolded himself from the car, reached into the back seat for the duffel bag, and ceremoniously opened Maggie's door, freezing like a footman. But she didn't move. She wouldn't get out. She would stay here in the car until somebody drove her back to the train station and sent her back to... Back where? Uncle Morris, balancing the duffel bag on his shoulder, turned up the walk and slowly approached the wide stone steps. Where could she go? Her uncle paused now and turned around to look at her. The duffel bag tipped him slightly to one side, and he rested on his walking stick. Back where? "You'll have to walk faster than that if you hope to make the front steps before nightfall," he called out. But she remained in her seat, her eyes fixed on the great stone wall. Back where? Back to North Wellington Academy for Girls, where just the day before the headmistress had told her she was a disgrace to the school? Back to the school before that, where she had lasted only a week? Back to the school before that? Back where? Back nowhere, that's where. And slowly Maggie got out of the car. Her legs were unsteady and she grew dizzy for a moment. She leaned against the car door and watched her duffel bag continue its progress up the front walk. Once again she looked over the broad wall of stone in front of her, and for a quick moment she caught a glimpse of what seemed to be a red hand following her arrival from a red head following her arrival from a high window. But then the wall was still, and only a sunbeam, caught on a snag of glass, burst into a flash of orange before it escaped and the windows were dark and empty once more. Uncle Morris reached the steps now, and very slowly, keeping her eyes on her feet, she started along the walk. She didn't raise her eyes until a long time later, when she reached the steps. There, on either side, stood a gray stone urn, round and fat as a witch's cauldron. If she was quick, she could climb into one of them while her uncle's back was turned, and he wouldn't know where she was. No one would. She could stay there until dark, and then steal away. Away where? She counted the steps as she climbed them. There were 13, and finally she stood beside her uncle at the double doors. In a moment she would hear the familiar sounds of a boarding school, scuffling on the stairway, footsteps overhead, voices in the next room, and from some fenced play yard a distant cry. Then she would see the girls themselves, the rows of uniformed girls, retreating down a hallway 2 by 2, staring at a blackboard 6 to a row, eating mashed potatoes at a long green table, always in rows. Some of them, knowing that a new girl was to arrive, would already have their eye on the door. At first Maggie could see nothing at all. They stood in total darkness, and there was silence all around. Just then, though, Uncle Morris reached for an overhead string, and a dim orange glow lit up the entrance hall. A small, pale figure in a coat stood facing her. No, it was a figure in a mirror. It was her own figure. Straight ahead was a strange apparatus with a protruding arm like a dragon's. A clothes rack it was, and it had a full-length mirror on its back panel. Her own reflection hung fragilely within its frame, and she stared at the white face, the brown coat, the pale legs. Thin as straws, as one of her headmistresses used to say. Uncle Morris hung his bowler on one of the dragon arms and his walking stick on another. The duffel bag lay collapsed on the floor like a sleeping dog. Something stirred at the far end of the hall, and Maggie stepped back. 2 figures, one in brown, the other in green, suddenly emerged. They gasped at one another, as though each would fall, they grasped one another, as though each would fall if the other let go, and stopped at a distance from Maggie, holding her in a long, fixed gaze. She had been looked at like that before, always on her first day at a new place, and always by the headmistress. These, then, were the headmistresses. 2 of them this time, and she waited while the 2 pairs of eyes traveled down her body, starting with her hair, wet and stiff from sucking, moving down to her shapeless coat with the beret bulging from its pocket, dwelling for a moment on her socks, both brown but not of the same pair, and settling finally on her shoelaces with their missing tips and tufts of loose thread. "Here she is," Uncle Morris announced, and she found herself being steered across the floor. "Margaret Ann Turner. But she pronounces it Maggie. She's 12 inches high. No, that's not right. She's 12-something, and she arrived with a girls' school on her head. But she's since transferred it to her pocket." He turned to her now. "Your great-aunt Lillian, your great-aunt Harriet." These were her great-aunts? The great-aunts in the big dresses and aprons who were going to greet her on the front porch and kiss her and tell her how happy they were she had come to live with them? The great-aunts were headmistresses? She was going to have to call the headmistress Aunt this and Aunt that, while everybody else in the school called them Miss something or the other. Her stomach fell. One of the two figures, the one in green, started to approach her, and in a moment she was lowering her face toward Maggie's. This was to be the kiss. Maggie tightened her teeth, waiting for a wet mouth to moisten her cheek, but the face stopped an inch or two away and held still. Now she was taking Maggie by the arm to lead her where? Maggie wondered. Nowhere. She was only holding on to Maggie's thin wrist, encircling it with her thumb and middle finger, and looking at it closely, measuring its circumference. "Skin and bones," she pronounced. "Skin and bones." And she dropped the arm, letting it swing like a loose rope at Maggie's side. Maggie turned away from the staring face and listened for the sounds of the other girls in their rooms behind the walls and above the stairs. Everyone was still, and in the dim light she could see no one approaching her, but her other great-aunt, the one in brown, who now stood next to the figure in green and joined her in examining Maggie's face. "Where is her hat?" she demanded. "Her ears shouldn't be exposed to the air. On a day like this she'll get earache." The aunt in green spoke. "There is no color in her face." The aunt in brown. "Look how she stands. Her spine must be crooked." "It's the diet. They never feed them properly in those places. And the air! They breathe stale air all day." They looked like hand puppets when they spoke, the kind Maggie had seen once on a television screen, with mouths that opened wide and let words out and then snapped shut, tight as a duck's bill. "Her hair is in strings. It hasn't been washed in months. Look at the color of her knees. Black. She could do with a scrubbing from top to bottom." And with this pronouncement, both mouths shut and only the heads moved, up and down, twice, 3 times, as though they were scrubbing her clean already with their noses. "Tell her lunch will be ready in half an hour," the green one said finally to Uncle Morris. Uncle Morris bent to her ear. "I have something to tell you," he said. "Lunch will be ready in half an hour." "Ready for what, though, I cannot say." He turned to the 2 retreating figures. "Shall I await a reply?" he asked. But they didn't answer, and in a moment they had stepped out of the glow of the orange light and into the darkness at the end of the hall. "First," Uncle Morris said, now to Maggie, "we will hang up your coat." And he led her to the clothes rack, with the protruding dragon arms and full-length mirror. Maggie stood before it and looked at her reflection, as she had just been looked at by her 2 aunts, letting her eye run down the hair in wet strings, the thin face, the black knees, the unmatched socks. Cautiously, she took her left wrist in the fingers of her right hand and measured its width. "Skin and bones," she thought. "Would you like to wear your coat while I hang it up?" Uncle Morris broke in. "Or would you prefer to remove it first?" Maggie shifted her glance quickly to the image of his face in the mirror. He was bending down, and his head was situated some 6 inches below the reflection of his bowler on its hook, making him look like a cartoon figure whose hat had popped off in a moment of surprise. Without replying, she removed her coat and handed it to him, watching as he placed it between 2 heavy woolen garments, one brown, one black, where it hung like a loose sack of skin on the bone of an outstretched arm. "And now," he said, extending his own arm, "we will sit in the parlor while your 2 excellent relatives prepare their usual culinary delights." The parlor. All these places had parlors. The main thing about parlors was that you were never allowed into them except maybe on the day you arrived. And the next main thing about them was that they were always gray plush sofas that no one got to sit on, gray plush chairs, gray footstools with gray cushions, undented by any foot, gray walls papered with gray feathered prints. The parlor that she gazed into now from its doorway was also gray The furniture was gray, the walls were gray, and the curtains holding back the daylight at the windows were gray. "This is the green room," Uncle Morris announced, but his strange jokes confused her, and she didn't respond. There was no green in the room at all, not even the rug, which was unexpectedly patterned with faded red and blue flowers and vines winding in elaborate knots. "It's because of them," Uncle Morris continued, and he pointed to two large portraits in identical frames, one of a man, the other of a woman, each wearing the clothing of long ago. There was no green in either picture. There was no color at all. In fact, except for a reddish tinge in the man's hair and a red patterned cloth at the woman's wrist. Everything else was in black and white, severe white faces and clothing so dark that Maggie couldn't see its outline against the black background. "They were the first headmaster and headmistress of the academy," Uncle Morris explained. "And their name was Green." Maggie stared into their faces for a moment, stiff faces with straight, thin lips and narrow eyes, headmistress faces, she thought. And she turned back to the rest of the room. A fan of magazines lay on a nearby table, and she read their titles. Health, Today's Health, Nutrition Digest, Body and Mind, Food, and You. Next to them was a careful pile of National Geographics, yellow and black. All parlors had National Geographics that no one read. Opposite was a curio cabinet with rows of ivory elephants and a wonderful china ballerina with peach-pink arms and an amazing skirt of china netting. Would she be kept in this new place long enough, Maggie wondered, to learn how to unlock the cabinet door and run her finger along the dancer's bridle, the dancer's bridle-ruffled helm? "She's been practicing that step for about 100 years, Uncle Morris said, following her glance, and she still hasn't mastered it. Think of what it would be like to stand on one toe for 100 years, for 50 years even. Have you ever thought what that must be like?" He turned his head, waiting for Maggie's answer. "No," she said, not looking at him. "No? Not once? You've never contemplated standing on one toe your whole life? Never once changing toes? Not even at night when no one was around to see?" "It's just a piece of china," she shrugged. "And—" Uncle Morris looked at her closely, so closely that she stepped back. "Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be just a piece of china?" Actually, she had wondered things like that. What it was like to be something that didn't feel or see or hear. What it was like to be the chair she sat on, or the lamp she read by, or the table she ate from, or the bed she lay in. What was it like to be a table and not know you were a table? What was it like to be anything at all? What was it like to be dead? "I'm told it's rather unpleasant," Uncle Morris said, and she looked up at him sharply. "Being a piece of china, provided you don't have to spend all your—" "Oh, I'm told it's rather pleasant," Uncle Morris said, and she looked at him sharply. "Being a piece of china, provided you don't have to spend all your time on one toe." Maggie stared at the rug, tracing its wanderings of vine from one border to the other, in, out, around, until her eye grew weary and the pattern jumped. Uncle Morris had fallen silent, and there was no sound at all from beyond the walls. Where was everybody? She strained her ears. No shuffle of footsteps, no rustle of clothing, no shout, no whispers, no sob even. Nothing. She slid a hank of hair into her mouth, twisting it with her tongue until it was stiff and sticky, and then stood without moving until a voice broke out with the suddenness of alarm. "Lunch!" It was one of the headmistresses calling from down the hall, and Uncle Morris sprang up to offer Maggie his arm. "Lunch!" he said, and his elbow extended, but she kept her hands at her sides. While he led her down through the long, silent hallway, his arm still raised as though he were reading a watch or carrying a length of window curtain. And that's the end of Chapter 2.